The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Zion Rivers walked through the double doors, his hands in his hoodie pockets, chin tilted with a calm defiance that rubbed some people the wrong way. 17, maybe 18 at most, tall, wiry, and unbothered. He looked like a kid waiting for a school bus, not someone facing a judge. The bailiff whispered something to the court clerk, and even the stenographer chuckled under her breath. The judge looked over his glasses and smirked. "Are you representing yourself, young man?" Judge Ronald Beckett asked with the kind of theatrical disapproval only a man in his 60s, used to wielding unchecked power, could perfect. Laughter rippled across the courtroom. Zion simply nodded, casually placing a folder on the defendant's table, flipping it open as if preparing for a quiz. The judge chuckled. "This should be educational for you." Zion didn't blink. "I hope so. Education's underrated these days." That silenced a few chuckles. The judge's eyes narrowed. This wasn't the typical sullen teenager he was used to. This one had a spark, and worse, confidence. The case? Petty theft. A high-end laptop from a tech store downtown. Security footage showed a young black male walking out with the item. That's all the store manager needed. That's all the police officer needed. That's all the judge thought he needed. But Zion didn't come to plead for leniency. He came to show something none of them expected. The prosecutor began with the usual script, bland, overconfident, armed with generalities. Zion listened quietly, occasionally writing something down. The judge looked impatient already, expecting a juvenile stammering his way through a defense that would collapse under the first objection. But when the prosecutor rested and Zion stood up, the room changed. "No objections to most of what the prosecution said," Zion began. "Just the facts." He paused, eyes locked on the judge's. "Your Honor, the laptop wasn't stolen. It was purchased by me. I have the receipt, time-stamped, and the video footage corroborates the purchase time. The only thing missing is acknowledgement." The judge raised a skeptical eyebrow. Zion reached into his folder and pulled out two documents, one the digital receipt with matching serial numbers, the other a notarized affidavit from the store clerk who had since quit. "She confirmed I paid in full, but the store manager assumed I stole it because I didn't wait around for the bag." The judge scoffed. "You expect me to believe this?" Zion didn't flinch. "You don't have to believe anything, Your Honor. Just examine the evidence." The documents made their way to the bench. Silence followed as the judge read. The gallery started paying attention. The usual narrative wasn't unfolding. Zion continued, unfazed. "Also, Your Honor, the arresting officer's report misstates my height, weight, and even what I was wearing. Minor detail? Maybe. But in law, details matter. Precision matters." The judge tried to interrupt, but Zion spoke again, more forcefully this time, citing Brinegar v. United States, Terry v. Ohio, and the standard for reasonable suspicion. He explained that race alone could not be the sole determinant for detainment, citing legal precedent word for word. And it wasn't just that he knew the cases, he understood them. His voice carried the precision of someone who not only read case law but internalized it. "I've studied your sentencing history," Zion added, pulling out another document. "In the last 5 years, 82% of your juvenile defendants sentenced to correctional facilities have been black or Hispanic. That's disproportionate to the arrest demographics in this district by over 30%. I'm not accusing you, Your Honor. I'm just presenting facts." The room tensed. The judge's fingers twitched. "You're bordering on contempt." "With all due respect," Zion replied, "I'm bordering on accountability." Gasp. Someone muttered "damn" under their breath. A reporter scribbled furiously in the back row. The judge glared, clearly rattled. "Do you think this is some kind of game?" The judge snapped. "No, sir," Zion replied calmly. "But I think the assumption that I'm too young, too black, or too unqualified to know my rights is the real joke." He flipped another page. "Even the search of my belongings violated the Fourth Amendment. No warrant. No probable cause. Just bias. The prosecutor tried to object, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. Zion, 17, was tearing apart a system with nothing but his brain and the truth. There was no need for theatrics, no need for raised voices or teary pleas. Zion's weapon was clarity. His shield was knowledge. He had taken a system designed to chew him up and dared it to choke on its assumptions. The judge tried one more time. You clearly have help. Who's coaching you? Zion's eyes didn't leave his. No one's coaching me. I read. I listen. I study. Some people go to court to be punished. I came to court prepared. The judge leaned back, folding his arms. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. Zion closed his file. Unless the court has any questions, I rest. He sat down, smooth, composed. The bailiff stared at him like he was watching something historic unfold. Because he was. That day, the court didn't just see a defendant. It saw a dismantler of narratives, a disruptor of assumptions, a kid who walked into a den of wolves armed with nothing but truth, and turned it into a courtroom of sheep. Zion hadn't just defended himself. He had indicted the assumptions the system relied on. And this was just the beginning. The courtroom emptied slowly, the buzz of disbelief and awe still lingering. But Zion wasn't celebrating. Outside the courthouse, he slipped on his headphones, tucked the folder under his arm, and walked away like it was just another Tuesday. For him, it wasn't about theatrics. It was about survival. He didn't just win a case. He dodged a future others had already written for him. But Judge Beckett didn't let it go. That night, he sat in his study, glass of bourbon in hand, replaying the hearing in his mind. A 17-year-old had outmaneuvered him, not just legally but morally. The numbers Zion cited haunted him. The ratio. The patterns. The undeniable implication. He pulled up court records. It wasn't hard to verify. Case after case. Name after name. Sentence after sentence. The data didn't lie. The pattern was his own legacy, and it reeked of quiet, unexamined bias. Still, the judge wasn't ready to admit guilt. Not yet. Not openly. But he was rattled. Because Zion hadn't been rude. He hadn't been disrespectful. He had been precise. Surgical. It's hard to hate someone who only holds up a mirror and walks away. Days passed. Zion went back to his regular routine. He tutored kids at the community center on weekends, worked a part-time job at a bookstore, and studied case law at night like others binge-watched shows. But something was different now. His story had spread. A local reporter published a column titled, "The Kid Who Schooled the System." It went viral. Overnight, Zion became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of razor-sharp resilience. News segments followed. Panel discussions. Think pieces. Not everyone was supportive. Some dismissed him as a fluke. Others painted him as a troublemaker with a silver tongue. But many more saw him as something rarer, a young man refusing to accept the labels stamped onto him by institutions too lazy to see past skin tone and age. The attention brought consequences, good and bad. Zion was approached by law professors who offered mentorship. Civil rights attorneys invited him to workshop. But there was pushback too. The store that had accused him filed a civil countersuit, citing defamation and lost business. Police unions called for investigations into his claims about illegal searches. Some local officials labeled him radicalized. Zion didn't flinch. He responded the same way he always had, facts first. He released a detailed timeline of his encounter, including audio recordings, statements from store staff, and clear evidence that the so-called stolen laptop had been paid for and registered in his name. When confronted by TV anchors with loaded questions, he answered calmly, never raising his voice. He didn't aim to humiliate anyone. He aimed to clarify. Judge Beckett, meanwhile, was beginning to fracture internally. For the first time in decades, he started showing up to his courtroom early, reviewing each case with extra care, asking questions he'd never bothered to ask before. He even scheduled a quiet meeting with the public defender's office, requesting anonymous data on his sentencing record. He didn't announce anything publicly. His pride still sat too close to the surface. But his colleagues noticed the change. The sarcasm in his tone had faded. The way he looked at young defendants, different now. Less presuming. More human. But change always invites confrontation. One afternoon, an older colleague confronted him in chambers. "You letting that kid get in your head, Ron? Don't tell me you're buying into all that systemic stuff now." Judge Beckett didn't argue. He just said, he wasn't wrong. That silence said everything. Legacy was no longer something he could hide behind. Not when a teenager had dragged it into the daylight. Meanwhile, Zion had started mentoring others like him. Kids caught up in petty charges, teens wrongly accused, youth convinced the system would never see them as more than numbers in a file. He didn't have a law degree, not yet. But he had something rarer, proof that the system wasn't impenetrable. You just had to learn its language before it learned how to silence yours. He started a small program at the community center called Legal First Aid. It wasn't flashy. Just folding chairs, cheap whiteboards, and handwritten case summaries. But the room stayed packed. Teenagers came with citations, summonses, and fear in their eyes. Zion gave them tools. How to read a charge sheet, how to request a copy of your arrest report, how to identify unlawful searches, how to speak in court without emotion-blinding logic. It wasn't long before public defenders started showing up to see what this kid was doing. Some were skeptical. Others were quietly impressed. Zion didn't try to act like a lawyer. He never pretended to be more than what he was, a kid who refused to be dismissed. The program started getting donations, not from politicians but from people, parents whose children were misunderstood, lawyers who remembered what it was like to be underestimated, activists who saw in Zion the rarest combination, fire and discipline, not chaos but control. Judge Beckett followed it all from a distance. He never spoke to Zion. Not yet. But every few days, he'd check the community center's website, read Zion's articles, watch the recordings of his seminars, and somewhere deep inside, pride started replacing resentment. The old judge who once laughed at a teen in his courtroom had begun to see what he had missed. Zion wasn't trying to win. He was trying to change. It wasn't about getting out of a charge. It was about pulling others out of the trap with him. And for the first time in years, Judge Beckett questioned the very foundation of his authority. Not because it was challenged, but because it had been built on a belief he no longer trusted, that age equals wisdom and position equals righteousness. In truth, Zion had more wisdom in his fire than Beckett had in his bench. And the judge knew it. Word traveled faster than Zion expected. Invitations began arriving, first local panels, then regional conferences. Civil rights groups, legal societies, even university forums all wanted a glimpse of the teen who dismantled a courtroom stereotype with nothing but knowledge and composure. Zion didn't bask in it. He wore the attention like a slightly oversized jacket, useful but not the goal. His focus never shifted from equipping others to do what he did, or better. What did change, though, was the kind of opposition he faced. It wasn't just about race now. It was about power. Established attorneys began questioning his influence. Commentators accused him of disrespecting the law by undermining courtroom decorum. One prominent legal columnist wrote, "Theatrics belong on stages, not in courts. Teen prodigies should focus on school, not stunts." Zion read the article once, folded it in half, and slid it under a growing pile of critique. They all missed the point. He wasn't there to make noise. He was there to make a shift. At the community center, Zion expanded the Legal First Aid sessions into a structured weekly program. Sessions now included visiting lawyers who volunteered to mentor teens. A former prosecutor reached out anonymously, offering behind-the-scenes insights into how charges were typically filed and how prosecutors made decisions based on assumptions rather than fact. Zion used the knowledge like a scalpel, dissecting injustice with precision and teaching others to do the same. But it wasn't just about teaching defense. Zion knew resilience wasn't enough. Systems didn't change from the outside. They had to be recoded from the inside. He quietly began preparing for early admission into law school. He studied judicial history, landmark cases, procedural ethics, not to mimic what he saw, but to reimagine it. Meanwhile, Judge Beckett was battling something foreign: reflection. For the first time in his career, he asked a clerk to pull sealed notes on a batch of old juvenile cases. Not to review them for errors, but to try and spot what he never had before. Names blurred. Details came back in flashes. Boys sentenced more harshly for minor thefts than others for violent offenses. He had dismissed their parents, rolled his eyes at their clothes, assumed defiance where there was just fear. And there it was, a thread of quiet cruelty that had followed him like a shadow, unnoticed because it had always been there. He didn't cry. He didn't confess. He adjusted. He started granting continuances more generously, listened more during arraignment, asked probation officers to give detailed alternatives to detention. He didn't tell the world he was changing. But the lawyers who had worked in his courtroom for years noticed it almost immediately. The hard edges had softened. The sarcasm had dulled. He still ruled with clarity, but now there was curiosity in his gaze, like he was finally seeing the people, not just the charges. Zion's name kept circulating. A private donor funded a scholarship in his name for at-risk youth who wanted to pursue law. One of Zion's ments, just 16, successfully challenged a wrongful truancy citation in court, using the very tactics he'd learned from Zion's classes. The clip hit social media and once again the public split. Some called it empowering, others dangerous. Courts are for professionals, one anchor scoffed. Kids like this need to learn their place. That phrase lit a fire under Zion. Learn their place was the foundation of every silent prejudice he'd fought since the day he was old enough to speak in full sentences. It was code. Code for stay small, stay quiet, stay invisible. So he responded the only way he knew how, by preparing others to rise. He held mock court drills, taught kids how to file complaints against unlawful police conduct, helped parents navigate confusing legalese in family court notices. His model was spreading across district. What began as a one-room crash course was becoming a city-wide ripple effect. And then came the unexpected turn. A local bar association reached out. They wanted Zion to deliver the keynote address at a youth and justice conference. It was a big deal: lawyers, judges, scholars. A space traditionally reserved for seasoned professionals. The invitation was more than ceremonial. It was a statement. The system, or at least some corners of it, was listening. Zion debated it. Part of him wanted to decline, focus on work at the grassroots. But another part, the strategist, knew the value of influence, of presence, of showing up where people didn't expect him. He accepted. The night of the event, the auditorium buzzed with anticipation. No theatrics, no flashy intros, just a teenager in a clean blazer, walking calmly to a podium under lights that once felt too bright for someone from his zip code. He didn't read a speech. He didn't quote philosophers. He told a story. About how systems weren't broken because they failed. They were broken because they were designed to protect those already ahead. How language and rules had been used to exclude, to intimidate, to criminalize people before they were even old enough to vote. And how the future of justice wasn't in bigger courthouses or newer jails. It was in education, mentorship, and relentless questioning of inherited power. The room didn't erupt into applause. It paused, stunned by clarity that couldn't be dismissed as youthful rebellion or emotional idealism. A few lawyers stood. Then more. And then, unexpectedly, one figure in the back of the room, Judge Beckett, clapped. Not politely, but with a force that admitted defeat and embraced evolution all at once. He didn't approach Zion that night. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Redemption wasn't about saying sorry. It was about doing differently. Afterward, Zion returned home and resumed his quiet grind. The next morning, he was at the community center at 7 a.m., setting up chairs. There were no banners, no cameras, no speeches. Just more young voices ready to be heard. And Zion, now more than ever, ready to teach them how to speak the language of power and rewrite it. Word of Zion's speech didn't just echo in courtrooms or among activists. It crossed into places he didn't expect. Law firms that once ignored community work now wanted to partner. Media outlets requested exclusive interviews. Universities started using his public case as a study in youth advocacy. But Zion had learned the cost of distractions dressed as praise. He declined the interviews and corporate invitations. He wasn't building a brand. He was building access for others, not himself. Still, not everyone was a fan of his growing influence. A state representative introduced a bill to limit the courtroom presence of unlicensed individuals after a minor's legal performance risked judicial integrity. The move was a veiled attempt to curtail Zion's impact, thinly disguised as policy. Zion responded not with protest, but with strategy. He helped draft a community counterproposal emphasizing the right to self-representation and expanding civic legal education in schools. He rallied support without fanfare, collecting thousands of signatures and securing a public hearing. At that hearing, he didn't even speak until every teenager, parent, and teacher he mentored had been heard first. When his turn came, he simply said, "If knowledge scares a system, then the system was never built on justice." The bill died in committee. Meanwhile, Judge Beckett found himself on the edge of retirement. He was eligible, respected enough to bow out with legacy intact. But something in him refused to leave quietly. Instead, he requested reassignment to juvenile court, a demotion in the eyes of many peers, but a necessary reckoning in his own. He no longer saw youth as interruptions to order. He saw them as mirrors, reflecting the cracks in the system he once believed was unshakable. He started issuing community-based sentences, invited educators to attend court sessions, asked teens what they needed, not just what they did. And when he didn't know the answer, he asked for help. Once a judge of towering certainty, Beckett now leaned on collaboration, including from people like Zion. He asked him to help design a pilot mentorship program pairing first-time youth offenders with trained community advocate. Zion agreed, but on one condition: it had to be youth-led. What followed was unprecedented. A courtroom known for cold judgments became a site of reform. Kids didn't just walk away with court dates, they walked away with mentors, educational support, and a plan. Zion trained volunteers himself, emphasizing dignity first, punishment last. The community program reduced recidivism by 30% in under a year. But change never happens quietly. A local tabloid published an editorial mocking the soft-on-crime teen justice fad, calling Zion dangerously idealistic, and accusing Beckett of being manipulated by a clever youth with an agenda. The piece went viral. It was meant to discredit, but it had the opposite effect. Alumni from Zion's workshops, parents, teachers, even some police officers began speaking out, not just in defense of Zion but in support of the transformation they saw. One officer recounted how a young man he once arrested later became a liaison in Zion's network, helping mediate neighborhood disputes before they escalated. "That's not idealism," the officer said. "That's leadership." The true test came when Zion's protégé, a 14-year-old girl named Layla, was wrongfully arrested during a protest and brought before a substitute judge who made clear she wouldn't be tolerated for acting like a lawyer. She invoked her right to represent herself, referencing precedents with confidence, just as Zion taught her. The judge scoffed, but she persisted. When a supervising judge reviewed the video of the hearing, the substitute was reprimanded, and Layla was released with a formal apology. That moment was pivotal, not because Layla won her case, but because she proved Zion wasn't an anomaly. He was the blueprint. From there, other cities took notice. Legal clinics modeled after Zion's initiative began popping up. Some failed. Some flourished. But the conversation had changed. No longer was the courtroom reserved for suits and gavels. It was a place where equity had a fighting chance. Zion received an honorary fellowship from a top law school before even applying. He turned it down. Instead, he pursued law the traditional way: admissions, coursework, licensing, not to prove he could do it the expected way, but to show others that both paths were valid. Access wasn't about shortcuts, it was about choices. And real justice meant making sure those choices were available to all, not just the privileged few. Judge Beckett eventually did retire, but not before ensuring the mentorship program was made permanent policy. In his final address, he said, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you enable others to build after you're gone." He didn't name Zion directly. He didn't need to. Zion's approach matured. He began publishing essays, sharp, clear, and grounded in lived experience. His tone wasn't angry or sanctimonious. It was surgical. Each paragraph dismantled complex barriers with clarity and empathy. Lawyers who once doubted him began quoting him. Schools adapted his curriculum. Courts began offering his workshops as part of diversion programs. Still, Zion stayed rooted in community. He spent evenings reviewing cases with teens at folding tables under flickering lights. No press. No applause. Just purpose. His biggest challenge came in the form of a national spotlight. A viral clip from his original court appearance made its way to a network documentary producer. They wanted to feature him in a series on youth disruptors. Zion hesitated. The mission was never about him. But then he saw the draft storyboard. Not about his rise, but about Layla, the Ments, the judge's transformation, the families that avoided broken cycles because of one opportunity. He agreed, under one condition. The documentary had to end not with his story, but with the kids now taking over the program. The future had to speak for itself. And it did. Zion's role began to shift from leader to mentor. He stepped back so others could step forward. The boy once laughed at by a judge now trained future public defenders, policy researchers, and civic leaders. He taught them that knowledge was only half the battle. The rest was knowing when to stand, when to listen, and how to build something that outlives you. He had no desire to become a celebrity. He didn't trademark phrases or write memoirs. He just kept showing up. Every week, every workshop, every time a kid said, "They don't listen to us," Zion replied, "then let's teach them how to make noise they can't ignore." Because in the end, his story wasn't about proving a judge wrong. It was about proving to every silenced voice that they were always capable of being right. When the documentary finally aired, it didn't just trend. It transformed conversations across the country. High school debate teams dissected it, legal experts praised its nuance, and most surprisingly, it reached households that never thought twice about who had access to justice. Zion's face was never the focus, nor his voice the loudest. Instead, the cameras captured the laughter of kids realizing they weren't powerless, the steady guidance of mentors building something real, and the stubborn cracks of a system beginning to heal, one case at a time. But with exposure came backlash. Opponents claimed he was undermining the rule of law, encouraging disrespect for judicial authority, even manipulating vulnerable youth into political pawns. Some media figures mocked his know-it-all charisma, and said he was dangerous precisely because he didn't look dangerous. Zion didn't flinch. He expected resistance. Progress always drags shadows. Instead of defending himself, he directed attention back to the kids, publishing detailed breakdowns of their advocacy wins, highlighting their resilience, their policies, their impact. Every criticism hurled at him became a platform to elevate someone else. At the same time, a former prosecutor approached Zion privately with a startling proposition. She was part of a statewide legal reform panel, and wanted Zion to advise on redesigning first-time juvenile offender programs. She admitted she used to see people like him as naive, until she watched the quiet, sustained ripple of his work. Zion asked for full transparency, a seat at the table, and more importantly, chairs for people often left out of the room: educators, youth counselors, impacted families. She agreed. Zion's presence at the panel meetings was met with initial skepticism. Some members thought his youth disqualified him from influencing policy. Others masked their condescension in politeness. But as discussions deepened, it was clear he had done more ground-level work than many of them had in decades. He knew which provisions failed real kids. He knew how language buried in legal clauses created pipelines to incarceration. And he didn't posture. He offered solutions. One of his proposals, implementing mandatory restorative justice sessions prior to sentencing for non-violent youth cases, sparked heated debate. Opponents argued it would delay justice. Zion responded with data from his own pilot efforts, showing not only faster resolution but higher satisfaction rates from both victims and offenders. The panel approved a trial run. Meanwhile, Zion continued mentoring. One of his students, Malik, a soft-spoken teen who once struggled to read court documents, began to shine. He organized his first legal aid fair at his school. Then another across town. Then one in a neighboring district. Zion watched Malik with quiet pride. He never needed to be the center. He just needed to make sure the center kept expanding. Despite the progress, Zion remained haunted by how easily the system could discard someone who didn't know how to fight back. He started offering crash courses in legal literacy to parents, translated materials into multiple languages, and teamed up with local clinics to provide round-the-clock hotline support. He wasn't just training future advocates. He was building shields for families who had never had one. Then came an unexpected turn. A teenage girl named Ava, 15, was arrested for defending her little brother from an abusive foster parent. The case gained traction when Zion got involved, not as a public advocate, but as her quiet legal support. The court refused to let her represent herself, citing emotional instability and the seriousness of the charge. Zion didn't argue. Instead, he guided her through every document, every motion, until she understood it better than most paralegals. At the hearing, her assigned attorney stumbled through details. When the judge mocked her account, Ava calmly stood, asking permission to address the court. She spoke not with anger but precision. Quoted state protections. Referenced precedent. The judge tried to silence her. But by then, the press had arrived. The room was filled with people she helped. Her voice wasn't just heard. It was undeniable. The case was dismissed, and more importantly, the Foster System Oversight Board launched a full investigation. Ava didn't go viral. She went to work, joining Zion's mentorship program and helping draft guidelines for youth protection in state care. This wasn't luck. It was the harvest of years of work, pain, growth, and relentless commitment to equity. Zion never claimed victories. He passed them forward. He stopped giving interviews. Instead, he published open-access legal templates for youth advocate. He trained librarians to recognize red flags in custody battles. He designed a toolkit for teens to identify predatory court behavior. And through it all, he never stopped checking in with Judge Beckett. Now fully retired, Beckett visited Zion's workshops once a month, always sitting in the back, listening. He said little, but his eyes said everything. One day, he pulled Zion aside and said, "If I had listened to one young voice earlier in my career, maybe I wouldn't have to watch so many fight to undo the damage I allowed." Zion didn't reply with comfort. He simply said, "But now they're watching you listen." The arc had bent, not toward perfection but toward responsibility. Zion didn't believe in heroes. He believed in choices. And every day he chose to show up, to uplift, to teach. Not because it made headlines, but because he remembered what it felt like to be laughed at in court, dismissed before he spoke, judged for the skin he was in rather than the mind he carried. His legacy wasn't a statue or a scholarship in his name. It was Malik organizing clinics in 3 states. It was Layla presenting at international justice forums. It was Ava turning policy into protection. It was Beckett sitting quietly in a room of kids rewriting rules he once enforced. Zion didn't need to be remembered. He needed the work to outlive the moment. And it did. That was his closing argument. Not in a courtroom, but in every hand he held steady. Every voice he taught to rise. Every life he helped prove worthy of dignity, before the system ever decided otherwise. The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment, it had become a battleground for change. Zion's unlikely rise had shaken the old guard, but it was clear that the fight wasn't over. His name was now synonymous with resilience and relentless advocacy, but behind every success was a deeper challenge, transforming a system that thrived on bias and exclusion into one that truly served all. Zion recognized that while individual victories mattered, systemic change required collective action. He began collaborating with civil rights organizations, legal aid societies, and youth empowerment groups. His approach was never to overshadow, but to amplify voices often ignored, those of the marginalized, the overlooked, the misunderstood. One of the most impactful projects was a coalition aimed at reforming courtroom protocols to prevent discrimination disguised as judicial discretion. Zion spearheaded research showing how subtle language, tone, and even body language could influence outcomes based on race, age, or socioeconomic status. The coalition proposed mandatory bias training for judges and court staff, backed by data and testimonies from affected families. At public forums, Zion's sharp wit and clear logic cut through cynicism. He confronted skeptics not with anger but with evidence, empathy, and an unshakable belief in growth. Justice isn't blind if it ignores who's in front of it, he said. It's willfully negligent. Meanwhile, the media attention brought a surge of young people eager to join his mentorship program. Zion's team expanded rapidly, fueled by passionate volunteers and legal professionals dedicated to mentoring youth. The program's curriculum evolved into a comprehensive boot camp, covering legal literacy, public speaking, negotiation, and the emotional intelligence necessary to navigate hostile environments. Zion's mentorship extended beyond legal training. He instilled leadership principles grounded in humility, accountability, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. He taught that true heroism was not about flashy victories but the quiet persistence of standing up for fairness in everyday moments. The cultural shift was palpable. Schools integrated his materials into civics classes. Community centers hosted workshops. Parents who once felt powerless began organizing their own advocacy group. The change was no longer just about winning cases. It was about reclaiming dignity and rewriting narrative. However, resistance remained fierce. Some judges refused training, dismissing it as politically motivated. Certain media outlets framed Zion and his movement as radical disruptors undermining law and order. Yet Zion met every obstacle with strategic calmness. He reminded supporters that transformation is always contested territory. One landmark moment came when a coalition-backed bill for juvenile justice reform was introduced in the state legislature. Zion had spent months lobbying lawmakers, preparing testimonies, and mobilizing public support. The bill aimed to reduce incarceration rates, expand restorative justice options, and eliminate mandatory minimum sentences for youth offenses. The legislative debate was intense. Opponents argued the bill would weaken deterrence and endanger communities. Zion addressed the chamber directly, presenting data on recidivism reduction and community healing from pilot programs. He quoted youth advocates, victims, and experts, weaving their stories into a compelling narrative that humanized the abstract numbers. The bill passed by a narrow margin, a victory that felt monumental. For Zion, it was not an endpoint but a milestone, proof that persistence and principled leadership could overcome entrenched prejudice. Throughout these efforts, Zion's personal growth was undeniable. The snarky teen who once challenged a judge with a joke had matured into a poised leader with a profound understanding of justice as a living, evolving ideal. He embraced mentorship not as a burden but as a legacy, knowing that each young person he empowered carried forward the work in their own communities. In private moments, Zion reflected on the journey from courtroom mockery to legislative triumph. He knew the system was far from perfect. Discrimination still lurked in hidden corners, crises would arise, and heroism was often quiet and unseen. Yet, he held onto the belief that accountability and empathy could chip away at even the most stubborn barriers. Zion also understood forgiveness as a necessary part of transformation, both for himself and others. He forgave Judge Beckett's earlier biases, not to excuse them, but to break the cycle of resentment that could paralyze progress. He encouraged others to find similar strength, emphasizing that true equality required healing, not just confrontation. Diversity and inclusion were no longer buzzwords but guiding principles embedded in every program, policy, and partnership Zion helped create. He advocated for intersectional approaches, recognizing that justice must address multiple layers of identity and experience. The movement inspired a ripple effect beyond state lines. Other regions sought Zion's guidance, replicating his mentorship models and reform strategies. He began hosting virtual seminars, connecting advocates nationwide in a growing network of support and shared knowledge. Zion's story became a beacon of inspiration. It demonstrated that transformation starts with courage to speak truth to power, to challenge prejudice, to demand fairness when the odds seem insurmountable. It showed that growth is possible even in the face of systemic failure, and that leadership rooted in empathy and integrity can reshape cultures. Despite his rising profile, Zion remained grounded. He avoided the trappings of fame, focusing instead on community and impact. He prioritized listening over speaking, learning over teaching, collaboration over command. As his influence expanded, Zion ensured that leadership was shared and multiplied. He championed mentorship programs that elevated diverse voices, fostering environments where young advocates could thrive and innovate. He recognized that sustainable change required many hands and hearts committed to justice. Zion's journey was a testament to resilience, how one person's determination to rewrite their story could ignite a movement. It was a story of transformation, not just of systems but of minds and hearts. It was a story that challenged every listener to consider their own role in creating a fairer world. He reminded everyone that equality is not a gift handed down but a right fought for daily. That legacy is built not on individual glory but collective progress. That heroism often looks like showing up, even when the outcome is uncertain. Zion's fight continued, fueled by an unwavering belief in the power of advocacy, accountability, and empathy. He understood that change was messy and slow, but he also knew it was inevitable when fueled by truth and courage. And in that relentless pursuit of justice, Zion found purpose, not in proving others wrong, but in proving what humanity can achieve when it refuses to accept injustice as normal. The courtroom drama that once shocked the city had evolved into a movement challenging the very foundations of the justice system. Yet, Zion knew that the path forward demanded more than reforms and legislation. It required a deep cultural shift rooted in understanding, inclusion, and shared humanity. He made it his mission to reach beyond legal circles into schools, community centers, and even corporate boardrooms. Zion delivered talks that stripped away the usual jargon, replacing it with raw stories of prejudice, resilience, and hope. His words were sharp but never cruel, embodying the balance of accountability and empathy. Equality isn't a checkbox, he insisted, it's a commitment, one that requires constant vigilance and courage. Zion's mentorship program blossomed into a national network, nurturing not just future lawyers but advocates, activists, and leaders from all walks of life. He believed that legal knowledge was a powerful tool, but true transformation came from personal growth, embracing diversity, fostering inclusion, and cultivating empathy. He emphasized leadership as service, teaching that the greatest leaders listen more than they speak and act with humility. One of Zion's proudest moments was the creation of a Youth Justice Advisory Council, composed entirely of young people from marginalized communities. Their voices informed policy proposals, legal strategies, and public awareness campaigns. Zion often said this council was his greatest legacy, not because of his own achievements, but because it empowered the next generation to carry the torch. Yet, Zion never underestimated the weight of the struggle. He confronted the harsh realities of systemic prejudice every day. The courts still held biases, public opinion often wavered, and setbacks were frequent. But each challenge only strengthened his resolve. He believed resilience was born from adversity, and that every small victory was a brick in the foundation of lasting change. Zion's journey also forced him to grapple with forgiveness on a profound level. He had forgiven Judge Beckett's earlier contempt, understanding that change often required patience and compassion for those trapped by their own biases. Forgiveness, he taught, was not about forgetting or excusing harm, but about freeing oneself to move forward without bitterness. His advocacy extended to fostering cultural shifts within institutions. Zion worked with law schools to revise curricula that perpetuated outdated, exclusionary perspectives. He collaborated with judicial councils to implement bias awareness training, emphasizing that accountability must come with education, not just punishment. Diversity and inclusion were no longer optional but essential. Zion challenged organizations to move beyond performative gestures toward genuine structural change. He underscored the importance of intersectionality, recognizing that justice must address the complexities of identity, race, class, gender, and beyond. Through all this, Zion remained a symbol of inspiration. His story, from a snarky teen mocked in court to a respected leader transforming the system, resonated widely. He embodied the idea that heroism is not about perfection but persistence, not about lone battles but collective progress. Zion's leadership style was rooted in mentorship and growth. He intentionally shared platforms with others, amplifying voices that had long been silenced. He believed that true transformation was a team effort and that legacy was built through collaboration, not conquest. In quiet moments, Zion reflected on the journey that began with a courtroom clash and evolved into a movement for justice. He understood that the fight was far from over, but he held fast to the belief that change, though slow and often painful, was inevitable when fueled by truth, courage, and empathy. He urged his followers and ments to embrace discomfort, to challenge their own prejudices, and to remain steadfast in the pursuit of equality. Change doesn't happen overnight, he often said, but every step forward chips away at injustice. Zion's story was a testament to the power of resilience and transformation. It showed that even those dismissed or underestimated could rise to lead profound cultural shifts. His advocacy proved that accountability and forgiveness could coexist, and that true leadership embraces diversity and inclusion as strengths, not obstacles. In the end, Zion's legacy was not just legal victories or public recognition. It was a living, breathing movement of empowered individuals committed to justice in all its forms. A movement that challenged prejudice, demanded accountability, and fostered empathy across generations. His story reminded everyone that equality is not a destination but a journey, a continuous effort to build a fairer, more inclusive society. And in that relentless pursuit, Zion found his purpose, not simply to win battles, but to inspire others to carry the fight forward. The once dismissed teen had become a beacon of hope, proving that even the most entrenched systems can change when met with courage, wit, and unwavering commitment to justice.